Diabetes Connections is brought to you by the OneTouch brand, providing diabetes management solutions for people living with diabetes, including the OneTouch VarioFlex blood glucose meter and the OneTouch Reveal mobile app. Taking a step forward starts with seeing where you are. And by Dexcom, take control of your diabetes with the world's first continuous glucose monitoring system that sends glucose readings directly to your compatible smart device. Live life on your own terms with Dexcom. Hey, it's Stacey. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, CNN correspondent and author Oren Liebermann has quite an unusual diagnosis story. He was diagnosed with type 1 while on a worldwide adventure with his wife.
So this was on our 1-year anniversary. We basically decided we could do sort of the quote-unquote normal thing and buy a house, buy a car, start a family, or we could sell everything we own, buy a couple backpacks, and backpack around the world.
Oren shares his amazing story, his book, and we talk a little broadcasting as well. Plus, College Diabetes Network is out with something new. It's called You've Got This, a guide for newly diagnosed young adults with type 1 diabetes. And I talked to two young adults who explain why that age group is a bit different.
I'm still transitioning into an adult, so I kind of want to do it on my own, but I kind of want help. So I'm kind of in that weird stage where I'm like, don't really help me, but don't help me.
Deja Gibson and Andy Zieger talked to me about that weird time when you're away from home, but not really yet an adult. Shoptalk with the folks from TrialNet and some big news from Bike Beyond. It all starts now on Diabetes Connections. Welcome to another week of the podcast. It is World Diabetes Day as this episode is released. Yep, November 14th. We've been talking about Diabetes Awareness Month a lot here and on social media, but November 14th is World Diabetes Day. If you're new to the show, welcome. I am so glad to have you here. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connections. So that means we talk to celebrities, athletes, and artists, as well as people, just trying to live day to day with type 1. My son was diagnosed right before he turned 2. It'll be 11 years this December. I do not have diabetes. My husband does have type 2. And I'm taking part in the World Diabetes Day Twitter chat. And that is on November 14th at noon. At least that's my spot. But of course, it's a 24-hour chat. And if you're listening after that and you missed it, it's very easy to find. I'll link it up in the show notes. But you can just search for it on Twitter, or I'll link it up on Facebook as well, so you can get over there really easily. But every hour has a different host with a different subject. So it's really fun even to go back and read the chats and how they went. I've taken part in this now for a couple of years as an hour host, and it's always a lot of fun. Of course, that is just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on all this month long and on today. So I will do my best to bring you links and notes from all over the diabetes online community. Make sure to follow along on social media and join the Diabetes Connections Facebook group. That's new. I would love to see you in there, kind of a behind the scenes and some more fun information, and we can all kind of chat to each other there. Before we go any further, let me tell you about OneTouch. OneTouch has been a trusted brand in blood glucose management for more than 30 years. This year, U.S. News & World Report named OneTouch the #1 pharmacist recommended in blood glucose monitoring devices and lancets based on a survey of pharmacists nationwide. Find out more about OneTouch brand products at diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneTouch logo. Haven't heard that music in a while. That, of course, is Bike Beyond, the cross-country bike trip put on by the amazing people at Beyond Type 1. And I want to tell you about a couple of things they are doing for World Diabetes Day. Okay, so Bike Beyond, we covered this event, New York to California. Every week this summer, we profiled a rider or a couple of them and told their stories. Well, now they have launched, as of today, their documentary. Neil Greathouse put together really just an incredible look at what happened on that trip from coast to coast, the riders talking about it, the ups and downs, literally blood sugar ups and downs as well as the hills. And I will link up as much as I can to it. I believe that they're making some of it available online, but the idea here is that they are looking for a distributor, somebody like a Netflix or an HBO to pick this up and really get it out there beyond see what I did there? Beyond the type 1 community. But they have a screening on the 14th on World Diabetes Day. And I know a couple of people who are going to be there. So I'll try to find out as much as I can about how it went and bring it to you. But more information in the show notes. And the other thing I want to tell you about Beyond Type 1 is that today, this episode is released, as I said, on World Diabetes Day. They are celebrating Banting's birthday. And I got a sneak peek at this website. Again, it will be linked up at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes. But, Sir Frederick Banting and his partners discovered insulin for therapeutic use. Sir Banting passed away in 1941, but his actual birthday, November 14th, is why we mark this as World Diabetes Day. So Beyond Type 1 is wishing him a happy 126th birthday. But they're doing this in such a creative way. Please go check it out. You can sign a card. They have sponsors giving money. You can raise money. But more than that, you can, really just get a smile about this today. Find something to celebrate. And a lot of the charities here are giving product and supplies to low-income families. So you can read more about it. But, at a time when we are all very concerned about the price of insulin and, remembering that Banting and his partners sold the patent for $1, this is a way that you can honor his memory and help some people in need. So well done, Beyond Type 1. This is a very, very cool and creative way to mark World Diabetes Day. CNN correspondent Oren Liebermann in just a moment. But first, a word from one of our sponsors from Dexcom. And we started using the Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system almost 4 years ago when Benny had just turned 9. It was a whole new world. The Dexcom CGM system changed the way we looked at his type 1 diabetes. When you can see and track glucose levels on a screen, it really is incredible, especially if you've relied only on finger sticks for a long time like we did. It becomes so much easier to spot trends and head off extreme highs and lows. The Dexcom G5 mobile continuous glucose monitoring system is the first FDA-approved device to let you make treatment decisions without pricking your finger. CGM-based treatment requires finger sticks for calibration, may result in hypoglycemia if calibration not performed or symptoms expectations do not match CGM readings. For more information, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Many of you know that I spent my career in local broadcasting. I was a TV reporter and anchor for many years and then a radio show host. And so talking to Oren Liebermann about CNN, it was a lot of fun for me. I met him at a conference this summer. He was signing copies of his book. He was talking to people about it and telling his story. And we got to talking, and it turns out we know a few people in common because he went to graduate school at Syracuse University, where I went to undergrad. That's where I got my broadcasting degree. And like most people who go to school there and are serious about broadcasting, we interned at the local TV stations. So we knew a few people. We were laughing about that. And we talk about it a little bit in the interview. And while we were talking about Syracuse, it was funny as I was putting the show together, the news came out that CBS named Jeff Glor to take over for Scott Pelley in the anchor chair at the CBS Evening News. The CBS Network News, the new network news guy is Jeff Glor. And Jeff and I worked together in Syracuse. We anchored the morning news show. It was called NBC Sunrise. It came on before the Today Show. It was my second job in broadcasting. It was his first. I want to say he had either just graduated or he worked with me for like a month before he graduated from college. And we had a ball, as much fun as you could have it at 5 o'clock in the morning. When I took that job, it was a 6 a.m. start. I got to work much earlier, but we went on the air at 6. Then they moved it back to 5:30. Then they moved it back to 5. And, I know that there are local anchors now that their show starts at 4. It's crazy. But Jeff is such a great guy, so hardworking. We had a terrific weatherman named Chris Brandolino. And eventually, of course, the three of us went our separate ways. Chris wound up being a meteorologist in Australia. He loves that. But it's amazing to see, to me, Jeff on the network news now. So I've got to dig out. I have a couple of embarrassing pictures, but they're probably just embarrassing of me. I mean, Jeff looks exactly the same as he did when we were on at the NBC affiliate years ago in Syracuse. I've changed a little bit. Anyway, congratulations to Jeff. And, that Syracuse connection, there's so many people in broadcasting who have passed through Syracuse. So when Oren Liebermann knew he wanted to go into broadcasting, and he'll tell the story more in the interview here, that's where he wound up. But then he and his wife, years later, decided to travel the world. And unfortunately, while he was in the Himalayas, he got very ill and he learned that he had type 1 diabetes. He is now the Jerusalem correspondent for CNN. He's doing great. He has a little girl and he has a book called The Insulin Express, One Backpack, 5 Continents, and the Diabetes Diagnosis That Changed Everything. So here's my interview with Oren Liebermann. Oren, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to Diabetes Connections. I'm talking to you now. You're back in Jerusalem after having visited and been in the U.S. for a while on your book tour. When did you get back?
Oh, my job requires quite a bit of travel. I came back just a few days ago, but I'm between quite a number of countries at the moment. I might be in Moscow shortly, but home base for me is Jerusalem.
So I have so many questions, not just diabetes, but broadcasting, and we have a little teeny bit of that in common for your stop in Syracuse years ago. But let's start with your type 1 diagnosis, because to say this was unusual, I don't think really covers it. Tell us a little bit about, well, let's back up. Tell us about the trip that you and your wife started off on.
So this was on our 1-year anniversary. We basically decided we could do sort of the quote-unquote normal thing and buy a house, buy a car, start a family, or we could sell everything we owned, buy a couple backpacks, and backpack around the world. So it's September 2013, and we decided, you know what? We're going to backpack. We're going to do the uncommon thing. And we bought a couple backpacks and just began moving. We started off in Europe, and we did a couple months in Europe, and then we went to Africa. My older sister was living in Kenya at the time, so we visited her. And then we went to Israel and Jordan. We were there for a couple weeks. And then the longest part of our trip was 6 weeks in Nepal. We knew we wanted to give back at some point, give back to the world we were seeing. And we decided the way we would do that is teaching English to young Buddhist monks. And it was an incredibly rewarding experience, but it's during this time that I started to feel symptoms. Only I didn't know they were symptoms.
Before you go on with that, do you apply for the job of teaching, or do you show up and say, I'd like to do this? I just, how do you plan for something like that?
You can actually do both, probably. We were in touch with an organization before called Alliance Nepal. We had been in touch with them a couple of years earlier because we thought of doing a vacation and teaching for just a little bit, so we already had the contact made there.
Got it.
So all we did was reach back out and say, we'll be in Nepal between these months. Do you need a volunteer? But you can actually do both. If you just show up in Nepal or many other countries and find a volunteer organization and say, hey, can I help? They'll almost always say yes. So we had at least arranged our volunteering. They would provide us with a homestay, so we would stay with the family of the organizer, and then we'd have weekends off, essentially. And we would be able to do whatever we wanted, and he built in a week of hiking into our stay in Nepal. So it was 5 weeks of teaching and a week of hiking.
But that's when you started to feel really bad.
Yeah, and that's when I started to feel symptoms. Except, like I said, I didn't know they were symptoms. So I had to go to the bathroom all the time. I was always thirsty. I felt weak. And I began to lose weight, but I didn't realize I was losing weight until very close to the end. I always made excuses for it, no matter where I was. I'd actually started feeling the symptoms in Israel, but I decided, you know what, it's a hot country, right? So of course I'm thirsty. And then we were in Thailand for just a couple of days, and Thailand was, the most humid heat I'd ever felt. So of course I'm thirsty. And then Nepal, it was the dry season, so of course I'm thirsty. So I was always able to make these excuses for myself on the road. And it was towards the end of our time in Nepal, or what was supposed to be the end of our time, that we Skyped with my parents and her parents night after night. And they both asked me, am I on a diet? I looked like I've lost some weight. So I said, no. We were walking an hour back and forth to the monastery at which we were teaching. And we decided that's it. I'm feeling a little weak, but losing a little weight. Great, I could lose a little weight. And one day we decided, you know what, let me step on a scale and find out exactly how much weight I've lost. And so the scales there are in kilograms. So I step on, and I'm looking back at the number, and I knew it didn't make sense. It's at 76 kilograms.
Ooh.
And I was doing the math in my head, and I looked at somebody who worked there, and I said, is this scale accurate? And they said, yes. And I did the math in my head, and I dropped something like 40 to 45 pounds.
Yeah. Oh, my gosh.
Far, far more than is helpful in a span of probably 7 weeks, 6 to 7 weeks. And that's when I realized something is very wrong. This isn't just me walking a lot and me being thirsty. So we went to the doctor. We went to a local clinic in Pokhara, Nepal, and the doctor talked to me for a little bit. We were probably there for an hour or so, and he said, I have malnutrition. Nothing else is wrong. I don't have an infection or anything like that. I have malnutrition. I just need to eat more and drink more fruit juice.
Ooh.
And this is mid-February 2014. So because I was so thirsty, for the next 3 days, I followed his directions exactly. I would chug fruit juice and almond milk and anything liquid, essentially, just to quench my thirst. And he gave me electrolyte powder as well to mix into my water. In those 3 days, I went downhill dramatically quickly.
Of course.
I went from feeling to feeling horrible. We were still teaching at this point at the monastery. And for 2 straight days, one day I just fell asleep in class. I went into the library and told my wife I wasn't feeling well, I'm just going to rest. And the second day, I just left class early and went to sleep back at our host family's house. And then we went back to the doctor and decided it is not malnutrition. And I walked in, and I remember just having this feeling like he wasn't surprised to see me again, like he kind of expected to see me, because his assistant knew exactly what to do. Pulled out a blood sugar monitor, tested my blood sugar, and the number was in the 400s.
Jeez.
And that's when he said, I'm sorry to tell you, my friend, that you are a diabetic. And that was how I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes.
Now, I will ask you an ignorant American question. Was the misdiagnosis initially, do you feel like this doctor didn't know what he was talking about? I mean, is the hospital and the doctor setting, kind of what we would think of as in the developing world? Or was it just a typical, well, you're an adult, you're healthy, maybe it's not diabetes initially?
I bet it's a bit of both. I think this doctor was used to treating people who came down with altitude sickness or people who just got a flu or something like that. And I think he probably thought to himself, a 31-year-old is not newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in Nepal.
Right.
So I think he dismissed it. He dismissed the possibility. As did my friends. I was speaking to some of my friends who were doctors back home. Well, and 2 of them pointed out you have the classic symptoms of diabetes, but nobody believed it.
Wow. All right, so you're in that room, and the doctor in Nepal says, my friend, you are a diabetic. What are you thinking at that point? Were you at least relieved to have a diagnosis, but you're so far from home?
Relief was definitely not one of my first 100 emotions. Confusion, I would say confusion was the first thing. Because nothing at that point, nothing made sense to me. My own life at that point didn't make sense to me. My own health didn't make sense to me. I knew I had to get home. That was February 13th. He asked me to come back for an official test the next day, a pre-prandial and post-prandial. And my numbers were high 300s. And so my official diagnosis came on Valentine's Day, 2014. And he said, you're okay to fly home. Get on a plane as quickly as possible. Go back home and see your doctor back home. And that was his second mistake. The first mistake was the misdiagnosis. The second mistake was saying I was healthy enough to fly, because I definitely wasn't. We got back to my host family's house at about 11 o'clock in the morning. And I just sat on the stoop of the house and broke down in tears. My wife asked me, do you want to go to the hospital? And I said, yes.
Yeah.
So we went to the hospital in the town we were in the city we were in. And so began 4 of the hardest nights of my life at that hospital.
What happened?
This hospital they weren't ready to handle a Westerner, an adult Westerner, newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And all of the people we had spoken with, from doctors to friends of mine with type 1 diabetes, had said, you should be at the hospital for 24 to 48 hours, 1 or 2 nights, maybe 3. They have to get your blood sugars in range. I was in DKA, diabetic ketoacidosis at that time. And then you should be good to fly home. Except 4 nights later, they're still telling me the same thing. We still need to regulate your blood sugars, and then 24 to 48 more hours, and then you can go home. And we've been hearing that for 4 days. And that's when we said, to hell with this place. We had a doctor we happen to know in Kathmandu, and he said, look, it's 4 hours door to door from that hospital, the one you're in, to a Western clinic in Kathmandu. You need to take a quick flight. Here's exactly what you do. And this clinic is top notch. And to give you an idea of the first hospital, 4 nights at the hospital, 5 days, including all my medicines, all the tests they ran on me, and paying for the room came to $180 total.
Oh my gosh.
And it's about what it was worth in hindsight.
Oh my gosh.
The second clinic, and this is in Kathmandu, so we left the city we were in, we went to Kathmandu. That was a Western clinic. And they said they took my blood sugar. I was still in DKA at that point.
Wow.
And they said, we need to keep you here. And at first, I was crushed. I wanted them to clear me to fly home.
Yeah.
But I realized very quickly at that second clinic, at that hospital, that I was in a much better place. And they switched my insulin regimen. And within 1 day, I was out of DKA. And within another day, they cleared me to fly home. So it took a week in 2 different Nepali hospitals, but I was finally allowed to fly home. And then, as the first person with diabetes in my entire family, I had to suddenly figure out what it means to have diabetes and how to manage it.
Yeah. So let's talk about your family, because you had said you were Skyping every night with your parents, with your in-laws. Were they frantic this time? I imagine when you were in the hospital, they were trying to keep up on what was going on, and they must have been so relieved to get you home.
Frantic is an understatement. The challenge of the first hospital is that it had no Wi-Fi. So my wife would be with me all day, and we had no way of communicating with my family. So she would go out at night to get Wi-Fi to send them messages on the updates. But unfortunately, the first hospital wasn't getting me any better, so there weren't updates. So that fed the sort of the chaos and confusion and worry, and didn't help anything. It stressed my wife, it stressed me, it stressed my family, and of course we're half a world apart. So it was very difficult. That first hospital was very difficult. At the second hospital, we were finally able to start talking to everybody. And when we booked our flight home, we stopped in Abu Dhabi. And my older sister's husband happened to be working in Dubai. So he came to see us that night, and that was fantastic.
That's
my first family member to see. I'm not home yet, but it's nice to know family is always there for you.
Yeah.
And then back at home, we all tried to make sense of this. My parents tried to learn about diabetes as quickly as they could, tried to help me out as much as they could. I tried to learn about this. We visited my doctor as quickly as possible. But at the same time, as I learned about how to live day to day with diabetes, we always knew we wanted to finish the trip we had started. My diagnosis came about halfway through the trip, and we knew we wanted to finish. We had 5 months left, and we knew we wanted to finish it. So that was our goal from the very beginning. My parents weren't happy about that. That led to a lot of screaming matches. I've often said the decision to finish the trip wasn't the smartest decision of my life, but it is the most important decision. Some might call it irresponsible or stupid. I'm not gonna disagree with that to an extent, but it was very important. It was my way of saying I will live my life by my terms, not by the terms that diabetes tries to impose on me.
I think it's fantastic, and I'll say that as someone who, if it was my son, there would also be screaming matches. But as the person interviewing now, I do think it was wonderful that you did that. How long did it take you to feel good enough and to feel at least comfortable enough to make that trip? It was not that long, right?
No, it was 4 weeks, 30-something days.
It was 4 weeks.
So my blood sugars were good, not great, but pretty good at that point. We had the supplies I needed. So my parents' argument was, I don't know enough about diabetes to travel. And that's probably a valid argument, except my response was, traveling with diabetes will always be different than working a 9-to-5 job with diabetes, or being fair, having a fairly steady schedule. So no matter how long I'm sitting here trying to learn about it, it will not help me in traveling when we're constantly on the move. And the only way to learn that is to do it. We traveled differently. I carried Humalog and Lantus pens with me. I stocked up on diabetes test strips, and I made a toolkit essentially. I always carried around emergency sugar, a glucagon shot, and that toolkit went everywhere with me. So we traveled a little slower. We'd spend a couple more days in each place. We always made sure we had a fridge that we could access so we could keep my insulin cool when we got to a new city. But we were determined to keep traveling. And were there a few mistakes? Yeah. Shortly after we got back on the road, which was in Thailand, I had a pretty bad low. And I had a couple bad lows throughout and a couple of bad highs. But each step was a learning process, and we knew it would be. The great part about it is my wife, Cassie, who was with me from the very beginning, right? We were traveling together, so we were together 24/7. She could look at a meal and tell you how much insulin I should take. And that was very helpful throughout the entire process, because she knew my diabetes as well as I did.
Well, I've talked to a lot of people who travel with type 1, and their point is that you can have a low at home. You can have a high at home. You know, it doesn't ensure, staying home doesn't ensure perfect diabetes management. So you might as well do what you want to do.
Let me try to make a link to the non-diabetes world. We have good friends who travel with 2 very young kids. And one of my cousins asked him, isn't it really hard to travel with 2 young kids and raise them? And his response was, isn't it always really hard to raise 2 young kids? In that same sense, diabetes is always a challenge. It's just where do you decide to accept that challenge? Is it at home? Is it on the road? Or is it a mixture of both? And we decided we would accept that challenge on the road.
So when you finished the trip, where did you finish? And what was that like for you and your wife?
So when we got back on the road, we went to Thailand and did a couple of months in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, China, Japan, South America, and then Iceland. Iceland was the last week of the trip. So we had gone more than once around the world. We started in Philadelphia and ended in Iceland, having circumnavigated the globe once.
Wow.
The end of the trip was a very strange feeling, and my wife and I talked about it for quite some time. The idea that this year of travel that we've been on is over. It's a very surreal feeling, because at that point, all you're used to is moving. And we felt very comfortable on overnight buses and long train rides. And suddenly you're not moving anymore. You realize, and we were staying with my older sister at the time. We were in her guest room, and we realized that's it. This is the bed we're going to be sleeping in for a few months. It's a very strange feeling having switched beds every couple of days. It's difficult to describe. An amazing feeling. We look back at pictures. We still look back at pictures and marvel at what we were able to do and our determination when the time is right one day in the future to travel again on a large-scale trip like that. It's an incredible experience. And anyone who's listening to this and thinks, should I travel the world? The answer is unequivocally yes. Do it. You'll never regret it. And we quit our jobs without any prospect of employment when we got back. We just had a little faith and a little hope that something would work out. And my wife, who teaches English as a second language, had a job immediately. Within 48 hours of us returning, she had a job offer for the school year, which was just a couple of weeks away at that point.
Oh, that's great.
So we were set up, and although it took me a while to find a job, it worked out great for her, and we made it work for us.
Well, and let's talk about your job, because you are now a CNN correspondent based in Jerusalem, where you're talking to me from Jerusalem today. Broadcast journalism, I know from personal experience, is not really a very steady profession. So when you quit that job, just so people know, it's not as though you can jump off that track and jump back on easily. So can you tell me a little bit about why you went into journalism? And I mean, we both went to Syracuse University. You went there as a grad student, and then we both have some stuff in common in terms of working in that local market for a little while. But you jumped around
Right.
for a little bit like most people do. Just take us through a little bit of that if you could, and why you wanted to go into broadcasting.
So first, why I wanted to go into broadcasting. This was not a dream of mine since I was a little kid. I always wanted to be a pilot when I grew up. Ever since I was 3 years old, that's all I've ever wanted to be. And I'm lucky enough now to be able to say in my spare time I'm a private pilot. In college, my dad made me get a business degree in undergrad. Except I knew even then I didn't want to do business. And I had an epiphany one day, my second year of college, that I wanted to do radio play-by-play for the Sacramento Kings, which is basketball for those not familiar with the team. And it came out of nowhere. This was my mission. This was my goal in life. So I went to grad school at Syracuse.
You're one of those. You're one of
radio.
those guys at Syracuse. Okay, now it's making sense.
Just for the listeners, every guy at Syracuse starts in sports. And my professor said, look, you don't want to do radio and you don't know anything about sports, which is true. You're going to do TV news. And I said, I don't know anything about TV or news. And he said, you'll figure it out.
For the record, Oren,
so
they tell all the women you don't want to go into TV news because there's 8 million women. They say you want to do weather. You want to be a meteorologist. It's true. Okay, so you said.
So yeah, I went into TV news, and my first job was in Dover, Delaware, at a small station. I was in the bureau. The station itself was based in Salisbury, Maryland. I was there for 2 years. I then went to Norfolk, Virginia for 3 years, and from there I went to Philly for another 3 years, Philadelphia. And it was at Philadelphia that my wife and I were married, and we left after 3 years in Philadelphia to travel. And when I left my job in broadcast journalism from CBS 3 in Philly, I honestly never thought I was getting back into news. I thought I would do public relations or video production or something like that when I got back. And after we finished the trip for about 4 months, I was doing freelance video production while looking for a full-time job. And then, as is very common in the TV business, I have an agent. My agent called me and said, CNN would like to interview you for Jerusalem or Beijing. And I thought, well, Jerusalem makes sense. Beijing, I don't know that it quite makes sense, even though I had a great time there. And the interview process started, and I wasn't quite sure how serious it was. And about 10 minutes into the interview, I realized they're serious. This is going well. They're serious. And it took quite a few more interviews. It was a very long interview process. But in February of 2015, so right about a year after my diagnosis, I was offered a job as CNN's Jerusalem correspondent, and I happily accepted. And that's what I've been doing now for about 2.5 years, a little more.
Wow, that's so great. And go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I write this towards the end of the book I wrote about the trip and my diagnosis. I can't actually make that make sense in my mind, how I got from Philadelphia to quitting and traveling the world to ending up at CNN. I can't draw those dots, but it worked out. And I feel a large part of CNN saying, yes, we'll bring you on as an international correspondent is because I traveled the world and showed them that I was willing to go anywhere and basically do anything. So I think traveling from the professional perspective worked out great for me.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I mean, who knows? But it really seems like something that they would look at and think, that's pretty unusual for somebody from Philadelphia, from the CBS affiliate, to chuck it all and go. It also shows, a big part of your personality. But can we mention, so your parents are originally from Israel, but they moved to the States when you were very young. You basically grew up in New Jersey. Do you speak Hebrew? Do you speak other languages? Is that one of the reasons why they put you there?
I do speak Hebrew. Hebrew is actually my first language, although I learned it up until I was 3.5 years old, and then we spoke it at home. So my reading and writing can be quite bad sometimes, but I learned it as a first language, so speaking is fluent. Learning Arabic, the two languages are very similar, Hebrew and Arabic as spoken languages, so that definitely helps. And I took Spanish in high school, so although my high school Spanish was quite bad, we spent quite a bit of time in Spanish-speaking countries, and my Spanish improved. Although now that I'm taking Arabic lessons, my Spanish has tailed off a little bit there as I try to think of a word in Spanish, and the only thing that comes up is the word in Arabic. But that definitely helps. A lot of CNN's international correspondents speak far more languages than I do, which is very impressive. So it helps. It helps to communicate with everybody, and I always encourage people to learn languages. The problem is, at least from my life, I know this, I wish I'd learned languages when I was younger. Of course, as an adolescent and teenager, the last thing I wanted to do was take more language classes. Mm-hmm. So during the perfect time to learn, I feel like is everyone's time to resist learning languages. And I regret that, but now I'm trying to make up for it.
Yeah, I also think it's tough here because we don't encourage it as a whole. The best way to learn it is to actually speak it. Those immersion schools are so great. As you said, you spoke it at home. I went to Hebrew school for forever, and you know how much I know. So it would not be helpful in Jerusalem right now. And let me ask you another ignorant American question. Many people listening are going to say, oh, how could he live in Jerusalem? Isn't it scary and violent? And can you speak to that for a moment? I mean, it's a beautiful place.
So I'll tell you a quick story before I answer the larger question. My brother came to visit last April, in April 2016. And he said, is it safe there? And I told him, don't ever ask me if Jerusalem is safe. You live in Newark, New Jersey. It's all the perception. I think Jerusalem is safe. Does it have its dangerous areas? Yes. So does Philly. So does New York. So does D.C. So does every city on earth. But my wife and I, and we have a 1-year-old daughter, we feel safe. The one part that can catch Americans off guard and Western tourists is that there's a lot of security here. There are a lot of either young soldiers or young security guys walking around with weapons. Some of them are rifles. You have to get used to that. It's part of it here. It's part of the safety. It's disconcerting at first for many, but as a whole, I think it's very safe, and we feel very safe living here. So everyone should come visit.
We may take you up on that. Tell me a little bit about your job, if you could. I'm curious how diabetes, how you manage diabetes on the job, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about, what a day's like and things like that.
So I didn't tell my bosses when I interviewed that I have diabetes. I didn't think they had a right to know. But once I got the job and came to my bureau, and there's now 8 of us in the bureau, the first thing I did on day one is say, look, guys, I have type 1 diabetes. Here's what that means. Here's what type 1 diabetes does. Here's what you need to know. And here's my emergency stuff. If I ever ask for my sugar, it's in my bag. If I ever pass out, glucagon shot, make sure you have the emergency numbers. So I was very straightforward with it. Part of that, I think, is I was diagnosed at 31. I'm now 34. And I was able to bring discipline to it, and I had no problem telling people, look, I have diabetes. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Let's not make a big deal out of it. And I was very open about it. Days in the office tend to be easier. Even though I'm less active on days in the office, I can constantly monitor my blood sugar, take insulin when I need to. I can figure out my meals. It's when we have long days out in the field that my blood sugar can be all over the place. If I know I'm going to have a day out in the field, especially if it's hot out, I will try to run my numbers high. 170, 180 is not a problem for me out in the field, because I'll have less time to check my blood sugar. I have less time to eat. So I have to err on the side of caution and make sure I'm not going to have some hypoglycemic episode. Again, my coworkers know what to look for. They know the symptoms of low blood sugar. It's challenging, but manageable.
Yeah.
You have to keep it, for me, top of mind. Once in a while check, once in a while eat, and then accept the fact that you're running your numbers a little high.
Well, I wonder, too, if like an athlete, and people might laugh, but I'll make that comparison. I know for when I worked in broadcasting, and even now to some effect, when the red light goes on, right before you go on the air or just as you're broadcasting, your adrenaline's spiking. And that's got to affect your blood sugar in some way. Have you figured that kind of thing out, or are you just cool cucumber and nothing phases you?
Well, look, I've been in broadcast journalism now for 12 years, so I'm kind of used to the red light going on and being on air. I have had a couple lows before live shots, I think twice. And at that point, it's get my producer to bring my emergency sugar over to me, keep the answers short and simple, and get my blood sugar into the healthy range as soon as possible. If it came to me having something, a dangerous low or very low, if I have to call my bosses and say, look, I need to skip a live shot, I need to get my blood sugar right, I can't imagine anybody would have a problem with it. My bosses, my team, and all of the people at CNN have been incredibly supportive of me having diabetes and being very open about it and trying to sort of do my outreach and my advocacy.
That's great. That's great. And I know producers love to switch the rundowns anyway. They enjoy that challenge. So.
All the time.
So let's talk about that advocacy, because the book is the Insulin Express, and it's a travel log and, of course, a story of your journey with diabetes. Why did you decide to write it? Some people diagnosed as adults do not want to go public like that.
And I know quite a few of those people. Part of it was when we started traveling, I'd kind of decided I want to write a book. I just didn't know what made my story compelling. And then I got diagnosed. And then I thought, okay, great. I have diabetes, but I also have a compelling story. And again, it came halfway through the trip, my diagnosis. So I took far better notes during the second half. And it still took upwards of 2 years to write out the book. But I wanted it to be funny, honest. I wanted to be very honest about how resistant I was to my own diagnosis at first and realizing something was very wrong. And more than that, I wanted it to be inspiring. It's supposed to be an easy read. I meant it to be an easy, enjoyable read. And I hope both people with diabetes and people without diabetes read it and think, you know what? It's time to travel. It's time to get on the road a little bit or do whatever else it is that your dream is. And I hope it does some of that. Diabetes is certainly a part of the book. It's the whole middle of the book is the diagnosis. And I didn't give anything away there. But it's mostly travel. It is primarily a travel-along, and then a bit of it is a diabetes memoir, and that's how I intended it to be.
Yeah. And speaking of when you say following your dreams, you wanted to be a pilot, and you were able to do that. Talk to me a little bit, if you could, about being a private pilot with type 1 diabetes. You can't be a commercial pilot in this country, right? But you can hold your private pilot license. Is it the same in Israel, or is that something you don't do anymore?
So I don't fly in Israel. It's all essentially military-controlled airspace, which to me simply sounds less fun than in the U.S., where you can just hop in a plane and basically go almost anywhere you want. I have not flown since my diagnosis because I haven't lost my pilot's license, but I have to deal with my medical certification. And after my diagnosis, I moved overseas fairly quickly. So although I will be flying as soon as I can, and I can fly, although, as you point out, not commercially, I will be back in an airplane as soon as I can. The problem is that just takes me being in the U.S. for a few weeks or a month to figure out all the paperwork, and I haven't had a chance to do that yet. I mentioned that I was born as my dad was finishing his PhD in aerospace engineering. His dream was to have his own airplane. So his midlife crisis was a few years back. He decided to build his own airplane.
Oh, my gosh.
So the family is lucky enough to have a home-built airplane.
You say lucky. Anyway, no, that's great.
I have 250 hours in that airplane. Choose your next words very carefully. I'm very sensitive about my airplane.
That's really exciting, though. That really is. Yeah, I fly all the time, but I'm a nervous flyer. I'm a terrible person to fly with. Let me ask you about your daughter. So you have a baby. How much has life changed from going to we just own backpacks to now we have a child?
Completely. We still travel a lot, but suddenly it's 5 suitcases, 4 of which are her stuff. She was born in Jerusalem. She's a year and a few months old. It's incredible. Certainly, I'm always afraid, and my wife will attest to this, that she'll be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes because I will view that as entirely my fault, as I'm the only one with diabetes in the family. And yet I try not to let it get to me. It's incredible being a father, and I'll be honest about this. As a dad, as a man, there was a part of me that kind of wanted a son as my first child. And the moment I saw my daughter, I was like, nope, that's what I want right there. And I love being a dad. I love having a daughter. It's changed life, but only in the best of ways. The schedule of an international correspondent is a little hectic for a dad. You know, I've been to London, Moscow, Nepal to report the U.S. So it makes it a little hectic, and there are weeks where I don't get to see my daughter, but it's an unbelievable, there's nothing like it on earth.
That's fantastic. I love your honesty. Thanks for sharing all of that with us, because, most
course.
People would not say, that's a nice thing to hear. And I don't know how to say this. It'll probably come out awkwardly, but I feel for you that would be something guilty about, because we don't have any type 1 in my family, and my son was diagnosed. And I know a lot of parents who spend so much time. Did I not breastfeed long enough? Did we give them milk too early? Did I give them grain too early? I mean, you just can't. I hope you're able to let that go at some point, because it's just got to be hard to carry any kind of guilt around like that. And, I don't have any advice. I just know that can be very difficult. And, if we knew what caused type 1, right, we would not do it. So.
Right.
That stinks.
And others have said that to me as well. And I hope I get to that point one day. And first, I hope my daughter's never diagnosed, obviously.
Of course.
And yet I know if it does happen, first, it'll be completely manageable, right? Diabetes care today is leaps and bounds, but beyond what it was just 10, 20 years ago.
Yep.
So I know it's completely manageable, and yet I feel like I'll always hold part of that against myself.
Yeah. I can only empathize a little bit on not having type 1 myself, but again, I really appreciate your honesty on that. Has the reaction to the Insulin Express been what you hoped? I mean, we were at Friends for Life, and I saw people lining up to get your autograph and hear more of your story. It seems like such a great adventure, something that most people won't do, but it's become really inspirational. Have you been happy with the feedback?
I have been. I've been very happy. I was lucky enough to have Sanjay Gupta from CNN write the forward. That was a lot of fun and a great honor. People seem to enjoy the book. I'm lucky enough to be in a position where I don't need the book to sell well, to put food on the table. And from that perspective, I'm able just to enjoy the fact that I was able to put a book out there that people seem to be enjoying. And it's still a little surreal when I talk to people and they say, "Oh, I know that story. I read it in your book." And that hasn't clicked for me yet.
and you partnered.
I need to get a better grip of what I wrote in there.
That's funny. And you partnered a bit with the American Diabetes Association on this, right?
Right. I knew I wanted to use the book as some sort of advocacy, some sort of fundraising. So a portion of the proceeds go to the American Diabetes Association from every book sold. You can purchase it on their website as well as, for example, on Amazon. And that was something I just felt I had to do. There was a wealth of information out there, and I wanted to help the fundraising effort for a diabetes cure, for diabetes education, for advocacy, for anything I could do to help, to sort of do my part there.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for talking to me and sharing your adventures, your stories, and, everything that we talked about. I really appreciate it, and we will look for you on CNN. Thanks, Oren.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Find out more about Oren's book, The Insulin Express, at diabetes-connections.com, or just click on the show notes. You can find them that way. I really enjoyed talking to him. It was fun to go back to think about live reporting and doing things like that. But what a story. Hard to imagine being diagnosed halfway around the world and then going back and finishing the trip. But he is so glad he did that, and I can see why. This is also a College Diabetes Week. The College Diabetes Network has their College Diabetes Week, November 13th to the 17th, where they really get out there on social media and get some great information out to people who need it. They're also having a Facebook Live event, and that is Wednesday, tomorrow night, November 15th at 7 p.m. as you listen, as this episode is being released. A conversation on type 1 and mental health with students and parents and healthcare professionals. And of course, that recording will be on their Facebook page in the future. So if you miss it, you can go ahead and listen back. But they're putting out a guide. It's called You've Got This, a guide for newly diagnosed young adults with type 1 diabetes. And I wanted to talk to some young adults about what that meant to them. Why did they need different guidance as opposed to being diagnosed as a little kid or as a grown-up. And, young adults now, you stay on your parents' insurance for longer, you're at college living on your own, but really not living completely independently. So there are some differences. I was really glad to be able to speak to these two. You're going to hear from Deja Gibson and Andy Zieger. I start with Andy and ask him to tell me your story. When were you diagnosed?
So I actually just recently graduated college, but I was diagnosed my junior year of college during winter break. So I had lost about 30 pounds over the course of a month, and I thought I was stressed from studying, but then I went home and we went to see Star Wars, and I went to the bathroom 3 times during the movie, and my dad told me I have to go to the hospital. And so I went to the hospital, and they said, your blood sugar is 673 and you have type 1 diabetes. And then I went back to school like a week later after winter break was done, and I went to school at the University of Washington in Seattle, and I quickly realized that there was no support network for people with type 1 diabetes. There were not that many resources. There's a lot of great programs in Seattle. Like JDRF in Seattle is great. There's a lot of clinics there, but there was nothing kind of like keeping it seamlessly together. So me and this other girl at the University of Washington, Cassidy Short, started a CDN chapter there, and then started building up the chapter and trying to build up a support network for people in Seattle with type 1 diabetes. And it was great. It was really, really fun. And I'm still connected with all of them. Our successor is a junior named Henry, and he is killing it. We've held multiple panel events in Seattle where we've invited therapists and disability resource officers and endocrinologists and researchers to talk kind of more personally with people with type 1 diabetes in Seattle. And those were really cool events. So yeah, it's been almost 2 years since I was diagnosed, but I kind of think of it as a gift, and I've really enjoyed it. So yeah, that's my story.
Deja, how about you? You were diagnosed as a teenager, an older teenager. What was your story?
I was actually still in high school when I was diagnosed. It was my senior year. I was diagnosed May 2nd, so that's really close to graduation. I was actually diagnosed the week of my senior prom, so that was kind of rough for me. But basically, I just started losing a lot of weight, and people were noticing, and I was athletic. I did cheerleading and basketball, so I just sort of thought it was a natural thing. You know, I'm drinking a lot of water because I'm doing all this exercising, and I'm losing all of this weight because I'm doing all of this exercising, and I'm peeing so much because I'm drinking all this water. And it had gotten to a point where I was like really frail and looked sick, and I kind of just went and got checked, and they were like, yeah, you need to go to the hospital immediately. And once I got there, they said, I don't remember exactly what my blood sugar was, but it was in the upper 700s. And yeah, they said if I would have waited any later, I probably would have went into a diabetic coma and all of those crazy things. And that's when I was diagnosed. And ever since, I've just been, dealing with it. I had it a little while before I went to college, so I was a little more acclimated with it by the time I got there. It was still an adjustment, though.
Yeah. When you went to college, did you look up the CDN chapter? Because your school had one.
Yes. My endocrinologist actually told me about it before I got there. He was like, yeah, your school does have one. And once I got there, I just kind of looked around until I found it, and that's when I met the president of our chapter at that time, which was Sydney West, and we got really close, and we did different events and activities and things.
That's great. Andy, when you said that you look at this as a gift, my eyebrows went up, and I'm just curious. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I've met some great people. I've done some great things because of diabetes. My son has diabetes, but that's not a gift to me. What do you mean by that?
Right. And I hope when I say that, that is how my experience has been. Like my cousin, who was 27 actually, and she was diagnosed like 5 months ago. And when she was diagnosed, we had dinner like a week or two after she was diagnosed, and we were talking, and she was asking me all these questions, and then I had to stop and take a breath and say, like, all of these things have worked for me, but they might not work for you. Your experience with diabetes might be different. So I say that because it's the things that have worked for me, and my response to it is how I've dealt with it. So it's not necessarily how everybody would deal with it. But the thing that kind of makes me view it so positively is I do research here at UC San Francisco, and I'm really kind of interested in like the history of type 1 diabetes. And insulin was first used in clinical trials in 1922. And if I was diagnosed at 20 years old before 1922, my life expectancy would have been 1 to 2 years. Yeah. And that 1 to 2 years would have been a starvation diet where I would have been told to eat 450 calories a day, and I would have lost a lot of weight, and then I would have died within a year or two of being diagnosed. And so the diabetes itself has kind of given me an opportunity to really empathize with anybody who is struggling with something daily. It's a silent struggle, but depression is also a silent struggle, and obesity is also a silent struggle. And there's a lot of silent struggles that I think people don't really talk about, but most people are dealing with. And I think diabetes has given me a window into that. But also, I'm just really happy to be alive. this is a very rare time in history where I can be diagnosed at 20 and feel like I have a relatively normal life and have a normal life expectancy. So I think it's been a gift in terms of how it's changed how I view myself and the people around me.
It's really interesting to hear. Thanks for sharing that. Go ahead, Deja.
I can kind of agree with that. Yeah, it's a kind of weird disease to get, but I've met so many people and had so many different experiences that I probably wouldn't have been able to get if I didn't have diabetes. So it's a blessing and a curse at the same time.
Yeah, that does make sense. So let's talk about this newly diagnosed young adult program that CDN is rolling out, because it's I don't want to say an odd age, but it's a difficult age. Between 17 and 25, you're getting ready to be on your own. You're still, for the most part, eligible to be on your parents' insurance, so you're still a kid that way. Deja, why did this appeal to you? I know you wanted to get really involved in it. And Andy, I'll get to you next, I promise.
Just being able to help somebody else and make somebody else's process to go through, being diagnosed a lot simpler and a lot easier. Everyone has different experiences and people are going to go through a lot of different stuff. But if I could just do something little to help somebody else along, I think it's a good opportunity to take.
And Andy, what did you want to add?
Yeah, it was such an interesting experience being in Boston. I think all of us that were there, we really wanted to share our experiences. And that's the cool thing about CDN is it's all about peer-based programs. CDN has over 100 chapters, and they're starting over 30 chapters right now. So it's really all about trying to get as many people within the system as possible. And so I just thought it was a really, really cool opportunity. I had only known a few people with type 1 diabetes at that point. So I thought it was a cool opportunity to share my experience, learn about the experiences of other people, maybe become a better advocate in the diabetes community because of it. And I think it was all of what I wanted out of it. I got out of it. So it was an awesome experience.
So, Deja, what kind of advice would you give to people who have been diagnosed between these ages, and really feel like they're floundering? They can't go see a pediatric endo. They're not really, on their own, adults working, many of them yet. What do you do if you're diagnosed as a young adult?
I would say, just kind of accept it for what it is and try to structure your life around it. It's a little tough, especially going to college and you're already dealing with all of these other adjustments that you have to make being on your own and all of, living away from home and all of that. And then you have to add diabetes to it. It's just something that you kind of have to embrace and kind of just deal with it. That kind of sounds harsh, but that's kind of what it is. You have to think about it as if this is something that I have now. And if I don't take care of it the right way, then it could harm my health tremendously. So just accepting it for what it is and making sure you're taking the right steps to make sure you're taking care of yourself.
Did you find that you were able to lean on family? You're still a young person at that age. I would hope that my kids would be able to say, even far away from home, hey, we need to do this together. Or I don't have anybody who's that old yet. My kids are still younger teens. Or at that age, are you kind of like, I'm doing this on my own. Thanks.
It's kind of in the middle. Still being on my parents' blessing, that's great, beyond great. And I was actually pretty blessed because I have family that live in Alabama. So I wasn't completely alone. I had people that I can kind of depend on, but at the same time, I'm still transitioning into an adult. So I kind of want to do it on my own, but I kind of want help. So I'm kind of in that weird stage where I'm like, don't really help me, but don't help me.
I actually understood that. Andy, what is the challenge, though, for young adults? You said you recently graduated college. There's so many resources for little kids with type 1. What's the challenge? What kind of gap is CDN trying to fill here?
Well, first off, I totally agree with what Deja was saying. You kind of, when you're diagnosed while you're a young adult, my parents couldn't give me my insulin shots 5 times a day. Nobody could count carbs for me. I wasn't going to ask my mom to move in with me in college. So it's you kind of have to completely accept the responsibility. But I think the big challenge, and this is something that I dealt with for the first few months, is I kind of had this feeling that I had to do it by myself. And my favorite quote by Benjamin Franklin is that we are in this world mutual hosts to each other. And I think my perspective on the diabetes changed when I let other people help me. Like I let all of my family know what my struggles with it were. I let my roommates know how hard it was emotionally. My mental health was one of I think I actually got my physical diabetes under control fairly quickly, but I think it was the mental health aspect of the diabetes that took me many months, and I'm still working on to strengthen. So I think that was the biggest challenge, is being a young adult, feeling like you have to do it on your own. But really, I think the best way to handle it is to try to get help from other people. And the cool thing, and this is what I found was really fun, was like when I let other people help me with it, I'm also helping them with something that they're struggling with. So it's like, it's the quote that I always like to say is, I can carry a 500-pound weight by myself, but if I let somebody else carry it with me, then we can carry like 1,000-pound weight together. And it's like, so it's just helping other people handle their things and letting them help you handle your thing.
You've both mentioned mental health. Let's talk about that briefly. It's such a huge issue, but it's good to know that there are more resources available for young adults with type 1. I mean, I personally think when you get the diagnosis of diabetes, mental health counseling should just be part of the treatment. And Deja, can you talk a little bit about that? Why was this important to you? And why would you recommend, some people still have that stigma and don't want to talk about mental health. How can we get through that?
Honestly, what helped me was just finding people who did have diabetes, who shared the disease, and just hearing different stories about how they dealt with it. Yes, I'm not going to deal with it the same way, and I might, but, everybody's different. But just being able to say, I have what you have, we're together, we have the same thing, we're dealing with some of the same things, and I just found comfort in knowing that I'm not the only person with this disease. I'm not just an oddball in these millions of people that are in the world. There are other people that are like me, and knowing that there's a lot of research going on to possibly aid the disease and possibly cure it also made me feel, better about things, and just knowing, getting to know. So doing your own research, not Googling things, because Google is the devil when it comes to stuff like that, because you hear all these different things that could possibly happen and get in your head. But just doing real research and finding out from real people what this disease is about, it really helped.
I heard you laughing, Andy. You agree with that? Stay off Google and WebMD?
Yeah, totally.
That's funny. And I'll give you the last word here, Andy, on mental health. I know there's a lot of online resources that CDN has going on this month. It sounds like this is something that you've already, in just the 2 years that you've had type 1, really thought a lot about. How important is the mental health aspect of this to you?
Yeah, and it's pretty cool because in the guide, so CN is releasing this guide on November 13th. It's a guide for young adults with type 1 diabetes. And in the guide, my favorite chapter is the very first chapter on the mental health section, where it discusses diabetes control. And that was the hardest thing for me to overcome, was this feeling that I always felt like I had to be in complete control all of the time. I would get down on myself if I wasn't in complete control, and it's hard. And that's the hard thing, and I think Deja really hit on it, is that people without type 1 diabetes kind of can't really understand that feeling of needing to be in control all of the time. But in the guide, in that first section where it talks about diabetes control, I love the advice that it gives, which is diabetes is our own. Like we will make adjustments throughout our life. We'll never perfectly have it under control, but that's okay. And we can strive every day to have the tightest control possible, but we shouldn't feel guilty, and we shouldn't feel defeated in the pursuit of trying to, attain that perfection. So I think the guide really, it handles mental health well. And I remember when we were in Boston discussing the guide, that was one of the key topics, because it's hard. Like you can physically manage your diabetes, but the mental health is the part where it's more of a constant struggle I felt with. And yeah, but the guide that will be released November 13th really does a good job of handling that, I think.
Andy and Deja, thank you so much for joining me. I love what CDN does. I'm hoping that wherever my son goes to college has a chapter, and I really appreciate it. We've got some time. He's the class of 2023, I think, so we've got a little bit of time.
Wow.
Yeah. But I appreciate your time. Thanks so much. If you'd like to learn more about the College Diabetes Network, please go to the show notes. They should be right there on your phone as you listen. You can also go to the website at diabetes-connections.com, especially if you listen on social media. It can be a little hard to get to those show notes, so the website is really the best place to go. And, a lot going on for College Diabetes Week, this week in particular, and it's always a terrific resource. I highly recommend the College Diabetes Network. They are, they're just full of resources for college students, obviously, but for older high school students getting ready to go to college and apply to college, and for nervous parents like I know I am going to be. All right, in our Shop Talk segment today, I love talking about Shop Talk because this brings someone from a conference to you. I'm very fortunate to be able to go to diabetes conferences, and I wanted to talk to a lot of people. And there's so many vendors and exhibitors at these conferences, but if you can't travel to them, you might not hear too much about them. And I wanted to talk to TrialNet. TrialNet, I think, is thought of in a lot of diabetes parenting circles as a test I can give my kid to find out if they're going to develop type 1 diabetes. The sibling of the child that already has it. We're going to find out if they will or they won't. But TrialNet, while it can help with that, it is so much more. It is such a big research project. And I didn't realize that until well after I was tested. I got tested because I thought, like many people, well, it's just going to tell me something. But it doesn't. It tells so much more than that. So to explain more about what TrialNet really is, here is Annie Abraham.
TrialNet, Stacey, is an international collaborative effort with centers all around the world doing type 1 diabetes research. So our goal initially is to screen as many family members as we can who have a child with type 1. We want to screen those family members to see if we can identify early any risks that may show up, any autoantibodies that are developing.
And what do you do with that information? I mean, to me, as a mom with a kid with type 1, it's twofold, right? I find out my risk or maybe other kids' risk in my family, but then you study that information.
We absolutely do. Every clinic appointment that child has when they come in is important to us in TrialNet because we're also gathering data for those mechanistic studies. Those are the studies that there's no result on, but when a child comes to us to screen or a parent screening in a family, we get that result for the autoantibodies. And we ask about the residual amount of that study. Can we use that sample doing other ongoing research? So TrialNet is not wasteful. We're doing everything that we can all the time. But a lot of those results aren't given back to the parents. They're just, a mechanistic study. So we've learned a lot with TrialNet, having screened about 178,000 family members, along with some of the other large consortiums like TEDdy, like the DAISY study. So that's led to a lot of really important information for TrialNet to learn about type 1 diabetes. And again, we're trying to get in as early as possible to figure out how to prevent it and eventually cure it.
When a family member comes and gets tested, if they test positive for the antibodies, what happens next for them?
So they get a call from us, from TrialNet, from one of the coordinators, because those are the folks that we do want to keep up with. We want them to stay in monitoring with TrialNet, have them come in periodically every 6 months or every year, because we want to monitor to see if there's any progression. We do additional testing for those families. So again, our goal is once we screen a family, if we identify someone at risk, we want to be able to keep up with them and be able to offer that monitoring part of the study. As if we identify at any time that their risk is increasing, then we could have a prevention study that they could be eligible for. So again, it's a continuum, the screening, monitoring, and again, offering at any point along that a prevention trial to people.
You've been working with TrialNet for a while. What's it like for you? Do you still feel hopeful? Is it still a positive experience?
Absolutely. What most of us say, and talking to the other coordinators with TrialNet, and certainly the principal investigators as well, the most enriching part about it is being able to work with the families. Because again, we screen so many families, we get to know them over time. Not just the ones that monitor, because our families that do screening, because we can rescreen kids, Stacey, every year until they turn 18. So this is kind of a long-term a long-term process for us, and we really get to know those families, and they're just inspiring is the best word I can think of.
Of course, more info about TrialNet on the website or in the show notes. I would love to hear what you think. I just hosted a dinner every couple of weeks. A bunch of moms and dads in my area, we go out together, and we had a dinner with a doctor. We had an endo from our area come and hang out with us, and it was actually really terrific. We were able to ask a lot of questions and talk to each other and learn from each other. And whether or not to do TrialNet came up. And quite a few people said that they were just afraid to do it, or they had done it and they hadn't gotten the results. They wouldn't get the results. And we talked about why it meant more than just the immediate results to our immediate families. But even knowing that, it's still very hard. I didn't get my daughter tested. I have a 16-year-old daughter who doesn't have type 1. And when she was very little, Benny was diagnosed in 2006, so she was 5. She just turned 5. We just decided there was too much going on and we would do it later. And then we decided, she doesn't it's just more stress. She's going to have to get a blood draw. And then I decided that she's old enough now that she can decide on her own. And I kind of wish we had done it. I don't worry about her. Of course, I worry about her developing type 1, but it's not the kind of thing I think about every day. So I don't think it would give me peace of mind that way. That is not something that keeps me up at night. I got enough keeping me up at night. I don't need that on the list. But I do wish I had done it just for the research alone. So let me know how you feel. I'll post this in the Facebook group. I think this is a great topic to talk about and find out where you stand and what you've done. It's really fascinating, and TrialNet is doing such good work. Let me know what you think. As always, you can email me, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com. You can leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen. And if you are listening on a podcast app, please go ahead and subscribe to the show. That way it will show up whenever there is a new episode. You don't have to go searching for it. And of course, we also have the newsletter. So there's lots of ways that you can find us and we can find you. Coming up this month, we're going to be talking about talking to your family on Thanksgiving, how to politely say, yes, I can eat that. We're going to have some fun, and we've got some great shows coming up down the line. Thank you so much for joining me. As always, I got to thank my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. He always makes the show sound great. And listen, I know your time is valuable, and I appreciate you spending an hour with me. I love spending an hour each week with people who just get it. It's really terrific. I'm Stacey Sims, and I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.